We are here in Snow Camp, North Carolina, here with some great individuals that's going to provide us some history about the Underground Railroad in the area, as well as Quaker history.
And today we're going to travel along many of the sites of the Underground Railroad here, and we've got some of our friends here that are going to take us around. Let's introduce everybody.
Greetings, my name is James Shields, and I'm the manager of the African American Cultural Arts and History Center in Burlington, North Carolina.
Hello, I'm Ron Osborne. I'm a member here at Spring Friends Meeting, one of the Quaker communities in this Snow Camp area.
Hello, I'm Max Carter. I'm a retired professor of Quaker Studies at Guilford College, and my ancestors left this community in the 1820s for Indiana.
Awesome.
Good stuff. So we're about to get rocking and rolling. Ron, you ready to take us in?
Sure.
All right.
Check it out.
So what year was this built?
This is 1907. This is the fourth meeting house on this site. So originally, this was a part of what's known as the Cane Creek Friends Meeting that's about 5 miles west of here. And in 1761, because of the distance and everything, there was enough families in this area that they started gathering at what was called the spring. And the spring is right down there where that little bridge is. Okay. And so they gathered at the spring, and that became the name of this meeting house in the meeting. And in 1773, they were granted official status to be their own standalone meeting. Okay. And so, like I said, this is the fourth meeting house on the site.
Was the design similar to the originals?
Very different. Very different. This takes on the style that happened after the Civil War of more of a Protestant shaped meeting house. Before then, Friends meeting houses were more communal, where we did not have paid or ordained clergy, and we had facing benches, and so there was no pulpit, there's no lectern or anything. And that's how this was built in 1907. And since then, over the last 125 years, we have reverted back to the more communal form of worship. We do not have paid clergy. We rely on each other and speaking out of the silence when somebody's moved by the Spirit. But we've retained the architecture, because this is on the National Historic Register, but we have tried to reform the seating and everything to make it more of that communal. So it's a hybrid.
Consider Cal and I completely novice as relates to the role of Quakers, and so can someone provide us just that background, just that hard-hitting background as it relates to the meeting houses, how they differ from other type of religious spaces, and what it means even still today to keep that sustained and evolving, hopefully.
Sure, and I'll start and I'll let these two experts jump in. So the Cane Creek area of North Carolina was the first place away from the coast that Quakers settled in the 1740s. They started coming from this area from Pennsylvania. And the folks from Pennsylvania had immigrated from the UK, primarily England, but also Scotland and Ireland, to the Pennsylvania area, because William Penn had become the proprietor of the colony of Pennsylvania. But New Jersey, Delaware, they were also Quaker colonies essentially too. In fact, North Carolina had a Quaker royal governor in the late 1600s here named John Archdale, namesake of the town of Archdale. So when Quakers came to this area, again, at that period of time, there was no paid clergy. It was very communal, very simple structures and such. Over the ensuing 100+ years, because of slavery, because of the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, Quakers in this area ebbed and flowed as far as their populations. And a lot of them, as Max had mentioned, migrated north of the Ohio River, where slavery was not as prevalent or even outlawed. And it weakened the Friends in this area, such that a lot of they began to adopt practices of other Protestant denominations around them, and around the end of the Civil War, they started adopting paid pastorships, and that's kind of how that evolution came about. So today, within 5 miles of this area, you have Quaker meetings that are completely communal, unpastored. You have Quaker meetings that are totally pastored. They wouldn't recognize each other.
Really?
And our meeting here,
the Quaker community.
that's right.
Well.
That's
No
right.
fight like a family fight.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. If you ever see Monty Python's Holy Grail and they talk about the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front, that's you know. But there's like 3 or 4 different flavors of Quakers within a 5 or 10 mile radius of this area here.
Our official name is the Religious Society of Friends. We were called Quakers as a pejorative term when Quakerism began during the Civil War period in England, the 1640s, 1650s. One of the founders of Quakerism, George Fox, was condemned to prison because he claimed that God spoke to every soul that God created. Men and women, Christ dwelt within us as a light within. You know, Quakers talk about the inward light out of John's Gospel, and the judge, you know, called him a Quaker, a rabid enthusiast, you know, quaking in the spirit. And Fox said, "Yeah, we're Quakers. You know, name it and claim it." And off to prison he went. But our official name is the Religious Society of Friends. We use the terms interchangeably, Friends and Quakers. Now, the beginning of Quakerism, again in the Civil War period in England, was a time of radical democracy, when you had this civil war of the common people against the royalty and a fight for the commonest he and she and their rights. And Quakerism arose out of that social milieu as a radical democracy. No ordained clergy, no bishops, no pope. Everyone was a minister of the gospel because God spoke directly to each, men and women. Women had authority and preached. And in order for Quaker worship to occur without ordained clergy, without liturgy, without a pope, without bishops, they simply gathered, not even in a building, sometimes outside, because God can speak to you anywhere.
Right.
And it was illegal for them to gather in a building in England. Yeah.
Right. That's why we call them meeting houses rather than churches. Church is people. And we said meeting house is a convenient place to get in and out of the elements. But original meetings met on rocks, on fallen logs, on hilltops, in graveyards, and waited on the Spirit. Mm-hmm. And if God spoke to anyone, male, female, educated, uneducated, young, old, they would share that message. What I always called silent meetings for my students was rhythmically impaired Pentecostalism. God spoke directly, and then you share that message. But no dancing, no singing, no clapping. Yeah. So a silent meeting, as Ron said, is unprogrammed, unplanned. You gather in silence and wait on the Spirit. And if the Spirit moves, you share. Sometimes you can go through the whole hour and no one says anything, but worship has occurred because you've communed. And that's another interesting part of Quaker practice. We don't use outward sacraments. We don't have outward physical communion, the Lord's Supper or Eucharist, because our communion is directly communication with the Spirit of Christ within, with God within. We don't baptize with water because our public witness of our commitment to the Christian faith is how we live our life. Okay. Let your life speak. Okay. So that's our public witness rather than a sprinkling or dunking with water.
So I grew up Church of God in Christ, which is tambourine banging and everything else in the South, right? When you came here to visit, how was your experience And as it relates to your religious background, if any, how was that experience for you?
I think the first time I went to a meeting, it was a New Garden meeting, and I'd never been there before, and nobody really explained to me. I had an idea of what I was walking into, but I wasn't sure. And so everything was silent, and it was beautiful, right? And so coming out of the black church and going to prayer meeting, how, in the black church prayer meeting, you sit, and then Miss So-and-so, whoever, nobody starts, Miss Gwen or whoever, she's the first song, right? And she gets up and she sings, and I felt compelled to sing a hymn. Sure. And people were looking. And then I asked the person that invited me, I said, did I do wrong? She said, no, that was perfect. This is exactly what we're looking for. So that was my first introduction to it. And I don't know, it was interesting. I've been to several, and like you were saying, they are different. Coming here is different than going to New Garden or going to Cane Creek. It's just a difference. And even going to Chapel Hill, I was there. Totally different, so for a while I was kind of confused until somebody had to explain to me, like, what's going on,
4 Quakers, 5 meeting houses.
Right. I mean, because, like, for example, if you go to a house of prayer, it's pretty much going to be the same thing. You're going to have the band, you're going to have, the music going on, and I really appreciate. I was just noticing that you have the wood exposed, because in a black church, you got to have the wood floor so that when you
stomp,
so you can get a lot out of the carpet,
right? Gotta have that extra drum.
That's right.
So, Murph, in your churches growing up, there's a lot of singing.
A lot of singing, a lot of wailing. I remember early on.
Wailing.
Yeah, it's just a way of projecting your voice from a historical perspective, specifically in the African American community, Afro-Indigenous communities that speak to. I feel like just a call to things from an ancestral standpoint and the way that things were done originally out in the fields, and so wailing is pretty much. I can't give an example of it. I mean, I could, but I'm a bad singer. But it's soul. It comes from the soul. Like when you hear the blues, it's no different. When you hear country music, it's no different. And so that's what it is, and that's what we're used to. Like it started usually with an elder in the church, and then everyone joins in, and then you get and then that's you get going, and you can do it for hours.
And then, so by comparison, sometimes you would come to a friend meeting where everybody's completely silent. Like you might go through a whole procession here where nobody speaks at all.
Sure. And there's an interesting equivalent of Old Quaker practice to that wailing.
Okay.
In Old Quaker practice, because it was God who was speaking through you when you shared out of the silence, people showed respect to that. You notice that we've got our hats on in this, because Quakers don't take their hats off in this space. It's not sacred space because, again, God is present everywhere. So we don't treat this as any different from any.
One reason why we don't call it a church.
Yeah. So the hats are on. But in a silent meeting back in the day, when someone is moved to the Spirit to speak, they would rise or sometimes kneel. Everyone else took their hats off because God was speaking. And the person took their hats off as well. And they turned their backs to the person in humility and bowed.
I've never seen that.
God was speaking. And in that practice, to show that this was God speaking and not their own creature, not their own will, they used a high-pitched monotone called sing-song. Oh, Lord, thou hast been... that sort of thing. And so you knew this wasn't old Jeb Cope speaking. This was God speaking. Now, that disappeared after the Civil War when the revivals came in. And we can talk about that history at another time. But there was kind of a wailing sort of tradition there.
So we're starting here at the Quaker, or the Friendship Meeting House. because you mentioned that was sort of the story where the Underground Railroad in this area started, was you had no need for slavery because of that sort of modesty. Is that right?
Yeah.
And
Well,
so that's what drove people to.
For the first 100 years of Quakerism, Quakers were involved in slavery. They had assimilated into a culture that never questioned slavery. There's slavery in the Bible, Onesimus, all of that kind of stuff in the New Testament. But beginning in 1688 in Germantown, Pennsylvania, Quakers who had migrated from Europe to escape persecution wind up in Penn's colony and look around and say, Quakers are slave owners? We've escaped persecution and now we do this to others? And so 4 of those Quakers signed a document called the Germantown Remonstrance based on the Golden Rule. Would any of us want to be enslaved? No. Then why would we do that to others? And from that beginning in 1688, it started bubbling forward through Quaker process until by the 1770s here in North Carolina in a slave culture, Quakers adopted a testimony against slavery, and you could no longer be a member of the Religious Society of Friends if you were involved with slavery. And that's why then people started leaving.
So were they leaving to head in spaces where they could continue?
Free states.
Okay.
Ohio, Indiana.
Okay.
What they called the West.
And see, this North Carolina and southern states made it very difficult to manumit free slaves. In other words, some of the friends that had slaves were setting them free, and then they were being captured and put back into slavery. And then the state made a law that you could not free slaves. So to get around that for a period of years, the Quaker organization here in North Carolina Yearly Meeting. This is a monthly meeting because we have business meetings once a month. In the yearly meeting, the whole state organization gathered once a year. Well, they became one of the largest slaveholders, if not the largest slaveholder in North Carolina, because they just held the title to the slaves, because if they tore it up or said you're free, legally somebody else could take ownership of those slaves. So as long as they held title, those enslaved persons could, maybe live nominally as free. And technically they were still slaves, but friends would permit them to keep their wages and work and everything.
They were known as Quaker Free Negroes. Quaker Free Negroes. Yeah.
I mean, they were protected because they were property. That was the only way. Before 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, if you were black, you had no rights. You couldn't testify against a white man. You couldn't sue a white man. I mean, it was all these things. And so in order to be protected, you had to be owned, because now you're property. So just like a horse or a pig or whatever, if I go and I steal your horse, I'm in trouble. Well, if I go and I steal your slave, you're in trouble, right? But if I just go kidnap a black man,
And so I did have a question about the Civil War.
Yes.
So when the Civil War was beginning in the Quaker community, what was the energy like at that point? What was the different messagings that was being had within the community?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
In Randolph County, where we'll
be on the edge of it.
On the edge of Randolph County, when they were calling a state convention to vote about whether to secede, Quakers dominated in Randolph County. Randolph County went 25-1 against even holding a convention. And this is known as the Quaker Belt. Guilford County would have been the same. And
Alamance was.
Alamance was too.
Get to center, we'll talk about the Hockett brothers. Quakers would refuse to fight. They opposed secession because of their opposition to slavery. And so they were either forced into the draft, and we'll tell stories about that with the Hoggets, or they went bushwhacking, or they worked in salt mines, or
that's right.
The salt works.
or they paid a substitution, a fee,
The long and
or
short
they
of-
went to Indiana.
Yeah, exactly.
Walked to Indiana.
And the long and short of it is, Friends were conscientiously objecting to the war, and so whatever avenue they had to them, whether it was, pay the bounty, the fine, which again was frowned upon because you were still giving money that was going to be applied to the war.
Sure.
Going to prison, going to the salt works, escaping Indiana, but Friends generally tried to avoid any type of service in the war and suffered a lot of persecution for doing so. This is another person at spring meeting, and he's buried here, but I can't tell you exactly where his grave. This is Jesse Buckner. He grew up a Baptist in the community. He became a colonel in the militia, but during the Civil War, he became very sympathetic about the Quaker stand against conscription and fighting in the war. And in 1863, he was coming home at night from a political meeting in the area, lost his way, and ended up at this intersection and saw the meeting house and went and sat on the steps. And after some meditation, the Spirit moved him to decide he wanted to be a member of the Society of Friends and to renounce, his role in the militia and the Civil War. And worse than being a Quaker during the Civil War was being somebody that became a Quaker during the Civil War, because they said, "Oh, you're just wanting to do this to get out of, your obligation."
Yes.
And so they imprisoned him again, and tortured him because he'd been a colonel in the militia and now he was a turncoat. And so, but he remained a member of this meeting until he died.
And it's
Jesse Buckner. And his descendants are still members here.
Thanks once again for following us on yet another Hometown Chronicles USA adventure through Alamance County, North Carolina. The time we spent with Ron, James, and Max learning about the Quaker religion and their involvement with the Underground Railroad was nothing short of awe-inspiring. It's always hard to go back home after spending a day in such great company and hearing their stories. Our time together was short, but I'll remember it always. Please join us next time when we meet back up with Ron and the crew, where we'll visit an outdoor theater space. Afterwards, we visit an historic house that's been in Ron's family for over 2 centuries, which they are working to restore. We'll wrap up the story with a roundtable conversation along the route of the Underground Railroad on Guilford College, under the shade of a massive witness tree which has grown in place before, during, and after the time when freedom seekers would have journeyed beneath it. If you love this kind of content, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel to see more. We'll see you next time on Hometown Chronicles USA.